When Enterprise newsroom staff sat down to vote on the biggest stories of 2011, everyone knew that the top two would be the two huge floods that beset the North Country, one in the spring, one in late summer. While both events caused untold damage, they were two very different natural disasters. The spring floods came on slowly over several weeks as a heavy winter snowpack melted and rain fell gradually. By late April and early May, the Saranac and Racket rivers had climbed over their banks and spilled into houses, businesses, streets, parks, and parking lots, forcing some people to evacuate and causing millions of dollars in damage. Irene had another dynamic entirely. On a single day of torrential rain, August 28th, the hurricane-turned-tropical storm showed off water's raw power, devastating communities along the Ausable River system. Roads, highways, and bridges were washed out, and homes and businesses were destroyed, all in a matter of minutes. Although the rivers receded the next day, people in Keene, Jay, and Ausable Forks have been putting the pieces back together ever since. While both floods left their mark on the region, they also showed how people in these communities can come together. Volunteers filled sandbags, neighbors pitched in to help neighbors rebuild, and countless people donated to assist those impacted by the floods. There's no doubt that these two disasters were the two biggest stories of 2011. The story of the spring floods actually began in the winter months, when the Tri-Lakes area was pummeled by a series of major snowstorms, each of which dumped at least a foot of snow. While skiers and snowboarders enjoyed all that winter weather, by the time spring arrived, the area's rivers and lakes had become swollen with snowmelt. Coupled with relentless spring rains, the stage was set for a drama that would play out over 2 weeks in late April and early May. The flooding began in the village of Saranac Lake, when the Saranac River climbed over its banks and spilled into parking lots, businesses, and homes. People who live along the river had to be evacuated, and the village closed the bridge over the Lake Flower Dam. Property owners on Lake Flower and other waterways above the dam were also flooded out. A state of emergency was declared in the village that would last for more than 10 days. The village wastewater treatment plant was inundated with water from the Saranac River, sending partially treated sewage downstream. Several sewer lines and retaining walls along the river were damaged, and the Hydro Point Peninsula at the foot of the Lake Flower Dam was undermined. A long section of the village's Riverwalk was also damaged. Firefighters and emergency personnel from 30 different agencies were called in, a response that officials said was second only to the 1998 ice storm. Many people in the community also volunteered by helping to fill thousands of sandbags that were placed along the river and Lake Flower. When the waters finally receded, village officials reported that flooding had caused an estimated $6 million in damage to public infrastructure. At least 30 businesses in the village were directly or indirectly impacted by the flooding, and another 25 homes or apartments were closed or damaged due to flooding. Based on a review of village records and the Enterprise news archives, the newspaper determined this was the highest the Saranac River and Lake Flower had climbed in at least the last 50 years, and maybe longer. Village officials called it a 500-year flood. The same day the floodwaters started to stabilize in Saranac Lake, a state of emergency was declared in Tupper Lake. The Racket River, which had been climbing for days, spilled over its banks, flooding several dozen homes on River Road, forcing people to evacuate. Racket Pond also swelled, flooding the village's wastewater treatment plant and nearby homes on Water Street, and inundating Tupper Lake's municipal park. Lake Simon and Big Tupper Lake also flooded. Numerous roads were shut down in the Tupper Lake area, including Damaris Boulevard, Water Street, River Road, and Racket River Drive. Traffic on State Route 3 and 30, which connects Tupper Lake with points east, was reduced to one lane by the rising river. Water levels were so high in the Tupper Lake area that many long-standing records were broke. U.S. Geological Survey records showed that water levels on the Racket River at Piercefield not only broke a nearly 20-year-old record, but reached the 500-year flood status as well. Damage to public infrastructure in both Saranac Lake and Tupper Lake was later pegged at $11 million. While both communities were eventually included in a multi-county federal disaster declaration, aid was only made available for damage to public infrastructure. not individual businesses or homeowners, most of whom did not have flood insurance. Other communities that were impacted by the spring floods included Long Lake, Lake Placid, and Ausable Forks. In Keene Valley, the heavy rains triggered what would become the largest landslide in state history at the Adrian's Acres mountainside subdivision in Keene Valley. The slide, which is still active, damaged at least 4 houses, some of which have been moved off their foundations. Irene was downgraded from a hurricane to a tropical storm by the time it hit the North Country, but it still packed a powerful and devastating punch. Rain from the August 28th storm came down in droves, turning small brooks and streams into raging rivers. Those streams then flowed into the Ausable River, which hit historically high levels and washed out town roads, state highways, culverts, and bridges, leaving locals and travelers stranded. The towns of Jay and Keene saw some of the worst damage. Gulf Brook, a small tributary of the Ausable, washed away part of the Keene Volunteer Fire Department and damaged several homes and businesses. Downstream from Keene, the Wells Memorial Library in Upper Jay lost 1/3 of its book collection, and the neighboring Upper Jay Fire Station incurred significant damage. In Ausable Forks, the river invaded entire neighborhoods, damaging homes that had just been repaired following flooding in the spring. In Lake Placid, the west branch of the Ausable River carried large amounts of debris downstream. Tree limbs, rocks, and mud piled up behind the State Route 73 bridge next to the Olympic ski jumping complex. Water peeled large sections of blacktop off of River Road. An excavator was later brought in to remove the massive mound of debris that had piled up behind and underneath the bridge. In the High Peaks Wilderness, flooding from Irene washed out the Marcy Dam footbridge and damaged the dam itself, draining one of the area's most popular backcountry campsites. The Duck Hole Dam was also washed out, and the pond there became a huge mudflat. The heavy rains triggered more than 24 new landslides on the High Peaks, some of them up to a mile in length. In response, the state closed all trails in the High Peaks, Dix, and Giant Mountain wilderness areas until it could assess the damage, clear down trees, and reroute washed-out trails. No deaths were reported in the Tri-Lakes region, although local rescue crews and volunteers did make some dramatic rescues. 2 days after the storm, Governor Andrew Cuomo showed up to survey the damage, along with a host of state and federal officials. Cuomo and his daughter Mariah walked door to door in Keene, speaking with business owners and homeowners. To speed recovery efforts, Cuomo temporarily lifted state environmental permitting requirements. He also pushed the State Department of Transportation to expedite repairs to Route 73, a vital link between Interstate 87 and the Olympic region, whole sections of which had been wiped out by the flooding. In mid-September, Cuomo returned to the area to announce the reopening of the road to traffic weeks ahead of schedule. Across Jay and Keene, neighbors pitched in to help neighbors, despite damage to their own property. People put their lives on hold for days to shovel mud, deliver food, and offer shelter to people displaced by the storm. Both communities established relief funds, and concerts, bake sales, and clothing drives were held to benefit the storm's victims. But the recovery effort also generated some controversy. As town highway crews worked to dredge and rechannel rivers, some observers said the bulldozers and excavators were making the brooks look like urban drainage ditches, possibly leading to worse flooding in the future. By late December, state DOT workers were back in parts of some brooks, restoring critical fish habitats and reshaping riverbanks to protect communities from future flooding. Irene caused an estimated $25 million in damage in Essex County alone. As the year came to a close, some people were still out of their homes and some were still waiting for federal relief checks. Looking at the aftermath of these two floods, it's clear that both events changed our world more than any other news story the Enterprise covered this year. It's taken months for the affected communities to try and pick up the pieces, and there's still a lot of work to be done.